He told them of the world of Bathus, somewhere among the stars, where the sea folk had built a number of thriving civilizations in the three large oceans that sprawled across its disk. He had been a meat man, one of the caste which earned a perilous living in large sail-powered land yachts that ventured far out to land and hunted the shoals of deer and buffalo that abounded in the storm-haunted continents. His particular yacht had been blown into uncharted lands by a freak gale. The rest of the crew had taken the yacht's little rowing trolley and had struck out for a distant lake. But Tethys, as master, had elected to remain with his vessel. The storm had carried it right over the rocky rim of the world, smashing it to matchwood in the process.
"At first I fell," said Tethys, "but falling isn't so bad, you know. It's only the landing that hurts, and there was nothing below me. As I fell, I saw the world spin off into space until it was lost against the stars."
"What happened next?" said Two Flower breathlessly, glancing toward the misty universe.
"I froze solid,"
said Tethys simply.
"Fortunately, it is something my race can survive. But I thawed out occasionally when I passed near other worlds. There was one, I think it was the one with what I thought was this strange ring of mountains around it, that turned out to be the biggest dragon you could ever imagine, covered in snow and glaciers, and holding its tail in its mouth. Well, I came within a few leagues of that. I shot over the landscapes like a comet, in fact, and then I was off again. Then there was a time I woke up, and there was your world coming at me like a custard pie thrown by the Creator, and, well, I landed in the sea, not far from the circumference wintershins of Kroll. All sorts of creatures got washed up against the fence, and at the time they were looking for slaves to man the way stations, and I ended up here."
He stopped and stared intently at Rincewind.
"Every night I come out here and look down," he finished, "and I never jump. Courage is hard to come by here on the edge."
Rincewind began to crawl determinedly toward the shack. He gave a little scream as the troll picked him up, not unkindly, and set him on his feet. "Amazing," said Two Flower, and leaned farther out over the edge. "There are lots of other worlds out there?"
"Quite a number, I imagine," said the troll.
"I suppose one could contrive some sort of, I don't know, some sort of a thing that could preserve one against the cold," said the little man thoughtfully. "Some sort of a ship that one could sail over the edge and sail to far off worlds. I wonder."
"Don't even think about it," moaned Rincewind. "Stop talking like that, do you hear?" "They all talk like that in Kroll," said Tethys. "Those with tongues, of course," he added.
"Are you awake?" Two Flower snored on. Rincewind jabbed him viciously in the ribs. "I said, are you awake?" he snarled. "Scourge, we've got to get out of here before this salvage fleet comes." The dishwater light of dawn oozed through the shack's one window, slopping across the piles of salvaged boxes and bundles that were strewn around the interior. Two Flower grunted again and tried to burrow into the pile of furs and blankets that Tethys had given them.
Look, there's all kinds of weapons and stuff in here, said Rincewind. He's gone out somewhere. When he comes back, we could overpower him and well, then we can think of something. How about it? That doesn't sound like a very good idea, said Two Flower. Anyhow, it's a bit ungracious, isn't it? Tough buns, snapped Rincewind. This is a rough universe. He rummaged through the piles around the walls and selected a heavy, wavy-bladed scimitar that had probably been some pirate's pride and joy. It looked the sort of weapon that relied as much on its weight as its edge to cause damage. He raised it awkwardly. Would he leave that sort of thing around if it could hurt him? Two Flower wondered aloud. Rincewind ignored him and took up a position beside the door. When it opened some 10 minutes later, he moved unhesitatingly, swinging it across the opening at what he judged was the troll's head height. It swished harmlessly through nothing at all and struck the doorpost, jerking him off his feet and onto the floor. There was a sigh above him. He looked up into Tethys' face, which was shaking sadly from side to side. It wouldn't have harmed me, said the troll, but nevertheless, I am hurt, deeply hurt. He reached over the wizard and jerked the sword out of the wood. With no apparent effort, he bent its blade into a circle and sent it bowling away over the rocks until it hit a stone and sprang, still spinning, in a silver arc that ended in the mists forming over the rimfall. Very deeply hurt, he concluded. He reached down beside the door and tossed a sack toward Two Flower. It's the carcass of a deer. That is just about how you humans like it, and a few lobsters, and a sea salmon. The circumference provides, he said casually. He looked hard at the tourist and then down again at Rincewind. What are you staring at? He said. It's just that, said Two Flower. Compared to last night, said Rincewind. You're so small, finished Two Flower. I see, said the troll carefully. Personal remarks now. He drew himself up to his full height, which was currently about 4 feet. Just because I'm made of water doesn't mean I'm made of wood, you know. I'm sorry, said Two Flower, climbing hastily out of the furs. You're made of dirt, said the troll, but I didn't pass comments about things you can't help, did I? Oh, no, we can't help the way the Creator made us. That's my view. But if you must know, your moon here is rather more powerful than the ones around my own world. The moon? Said Two Flower. I don't If I've got to spell it out, said the troll testily, I'm suffering from chronic tides. A bell jangled in the darkness of the shack. Tethys strode across the creaking floor to the complicated devices of levers, strings, and bells that was mounted on the circumference's topmost strand where it passed through the hut. The bell rang again, and then started to clang away in an odd, jerky rhythm for several minutes. The troll stood with his ear pressed close to it. When it stopped, he turned slowly and looked at them with a worried frown. You're more important than I thought, he said. You're not to wait for the salvage fleet. You're to be collected by a flyer. That's what they say in Kroll.
He shrugged.
And I hadn't even sent a message that you're here yet. Someone's been drinking walnut wine again.
He picked up a large mallet that hung on a pillar beside the bell and used it to tap out a brief carillon.
That'll be passed from Lengthman to Lengthman all the way back to Kroll, he said. Marvelous, really, isn't it?
It came speeding across the sea, floating a man-length above it, but still leaving a foaming wake as whatever power that held it up smacked brutally into the water. Rincewind knew what power held it up. He would be the first to admit, a coward, an incompetent, and not even very good at being a failure. But he was still a wizard of sorts. He knew one of the 8 great spells. He would be claimed by Death himself when he died, and he recognized really finely honed magic when he saw it. The lens skimming toward the island was perhaps 20 feet across and totally transparent. Sitting around its circumference were a large number of black-robed men, each one strapped securely to the disc by a leather harness, and each one staring down at the waves with an expression so tormented, so agonizing, that the transparent disc seemed to be ringed with gargoyles. Rincewind sighed with relief. This was such an unusual sound that it made Two-Flower take his eyes off the approaching disc and turn them on him.
We're too important. No lie, explained Rincewind. They wouldn't be wasting all that magic on a couple of potential slaves, he grinned. What is it? Said Two-Flower. Well, the disc itself would have been created by Fresnel's wonderful concentrator, said Rincewind authoritatively. That called for many rare and unstable ingredients, such as demon's breath and so forth, and it takes at least 8 4th-grade wizards a week to envision. And there's those wizards on it who must all be gifted hydrophobes. You mean they hate water? Said Two-Flower. No, that wouldn't work, said Rincewind. Hate is an attracting force, just like love. They really loathe it. The very idea of it revolts them. A really good hydrophobe has to be trained on dehydrated water from birth. I mean, that costs a fortune in magic alone. But they make great weather magicians. Rain clouds just give up and go away. It sounds terrible, said the water troll behind them. And they all die young, said Rincewind, ignoring him. They just can't live with themselves. Sometimes I think a man could wander across the disc all his life and not see everything there is to see, said Two-Flower. And now it seems there are lots of other worlds as well. When I think I might die without seeing 100th of all there is to see, it makes me feel... He paused, then added, well, humble, I suppose, and very angry, of course. The flyer halted a few yards hubward of the island, throwing up a sheet of spray. It hung there, spinning slowly. A hooded figure standing by the stubby pillar at the exact center of the lens beckoned to them. You'd better wait out, said the troll. It doesn't do to keep them waiting. It has been nice to make your acquaintance. He shook them both wetly by the hand. As he waded out a little way with them, the 2 nearest loathers on the lens shield shied away with expressions of extreme disgust.
The hooded figure reached down with one hand and released a rope ladder. In its other hand, it held a silver rod, which had about it the unmistakable air designed for killing people. Rincewind's first impression was reinforced when the figure raised the stick and waved it carelessly toward the shore. A section of rock vanished, leaving a small gray haze of nothingness.
That's so you don't think I'm afraid to use it,
Said the figure.
Don't think you're afraid,
Said Rincewind. The hooded figure snorted.
We know all about you, Rincewind, the magician. You are a man of great cunning and artifice. You laugh in the face of death. Your affected air of craven cowardice does not fool me.
It fooled Rincewind. He began, and paled as the nothingness stick was turned toward him.
I see you know all about me,
he finished weakly, and sat down heavily on the slippery surface. He and Two Flower, under instructions from the hooded commander, strapped themselves down to rings set in the transparent disc.
If you make the merest suggestion of weaving a spell,
said the darkness under the hood,
you die. Third quadrant, reconcile. Ninth quadrant, redouble. Forward all.
A wall of water shot into the air behind Rincewind, and the disc jerked suddenly. The dreadful presence of the sea troll had probably concentrated the hydrophobe's mind wonderfully, because it then rose at a very steep angle and didn't begin to level flight until it was a dozen fathoms above the waves. Rincewind glanced down through the transparent surface and wished he hadn't.
Well, off again then,
said Two Flower cheerfully. He turned and waved at the troll, now no more than a speck on the edge of the world. Rincewind glared at him.
Doesn't anything ever worry you?
He asked.
We're still alive, aren't we?
Asked Two Flower.
And you yourself said they wouldn't be going to all this trouble if we were just going to be slaves. I expect Tethys was exaggerating. I expect it's all a misunderstanding. I expect we'll be sent home. After we've seen Kroll, of course. And I must say, it all sounds fascinating. Oh, yes, said Rincewind in a hollow voice. Fascinating. He was thinking, I've seen excitement, and I've seen boredom, and boredom was best.
Had either of them happened to look down at that moment, they would have noticed a strange V-shaped wave surging through the water far below them, its apex pointing directly at Tethys's island. But they weren't looking. The 24 hydrophobic magicians were looking, but to them it was just another piece of dreadfulness, not really any different from the liquid horror around it. They were probably right. Sometimes before all this, the blazing pirate ship had hissed under the waves and started the long, slow slide toward the distant ooze. It was more distant than average, because directly under the stricken keel was the Gorunna Trench, a chasm in the disk's surface that was so black, so deep, and so reputedly evil that even the krakens went there fearfully and in pairs. In less reputedly evil chasms, the fish went about with natural lights on their heads and on the whole managed quite well. In Gorunna, they left them unlit, and insofar as it is possible for something without legs to creep, they crept. They tended to bump into things too. Horrible things. The water around the ship turned from green to purple, from purple to black, from black to a darkness so complete that blackness itself seemed merely gray by comparison. Most of its timbers had already been crushed into splinters under the intense pressure. It spiraled past groves of nightmare polyps and drifting forests of seaweed which glowed with faint, diseased colors. Things brushed it briefly with soft, cold tentacles as they darted away into the freezing silence. Something rose up from the murk and ate it in one mouthful. Some time later, the islanders on a little rimward atoll were amazed to find, washed into their little local lagoon, the wave-rocked corpse of a hideous sea monster, all beaks, eyes, and tentacles. They were further astonished at its size, since it was rather larger than their village. But their surprise was tiny compared to the huge, stricken expression on the face of the dead monster, which appeared to have been trampled to death. Somewhat farther rimward of the atoll, a couple of little boats, trolling a net for the ferocious, free-swimming oysters which abounded in those seas, caught something that dragged both vessels for several miles before one captain had the sense of mind to sever the lines. But even his bewilderment was as nothing compared to that of the islanders on the last atoll in the archipelago. During the following night, they were awakened by a terrific crashing and splintering noise coming from their minute jungle. When some of the bolder spirits went to investigate in the morning, they found that the trees had been smashed in a broad swath that started on the hubmost shore of the atoll and made a line of total destruction pointing precisely edgewise, littered with broken lianas, crushed bushes, and a few bewildered and angry oysters. They were high enough now to see the wide curve of the rim sweeping away from them, lapped by the fluffy clouds that mercifully hid the waterfall for most of the time. From up here, the sea, a deep blue dappled with cloud shadows, looked almost inviting. Rincewind shuddered. "Excuse me," he said. The hooded figure turned from its contemplation of the distant haze and raised its wand threateningly. "I don't want to use this," it said. "You don't," said Rincewind. "What is it, anyway?" said Twoflower. "A Honduras wand of utter negativity." "A Honduras wand of utter negativity," said Rincewind. "And I wish you'd stop waving it about. It might go off," he added, nodding at the wand's glittering point. "I mean, it's all very flattering, all this magic being used just for our benefit, but there's no need to go quite that far and—" "Shut up!" The figure reached up and pulled back its hood, revealing itself to be the most unusually tinted young woman. Her skin was black, not the dark brown of Urabiwi or the polished blue-black of monsoon-haunted Klatch, but the deep black of midnight at the bottom of a cave. Her hair and eyebrows were the color of moonlight. There was the same pale sheen around her lips. She looked about 15 and very frightened. Rincewind couldn't help noticing that the hand holding the wand was shaking. This was because a piece of sudden death, wobbling uncertainly a mere 5 feet from your nose, is very hard to miss. It dawned on him very slowly, because it was a completely new sensation, that someone in the world was frightened of him. The complete reverse was so often the case that he had to come to think of it as a kind of natural law. "What is your name?" he said, as reassuringly as he could manage. She might be frightened, but she did have the wand. "If I had a wand like that," he thought, "I wouldn't be frightened of anything."
So what in creation can she imagine I could do?
My name is Immaterial, she said.
That's a pretty name,
Said Rincewind.
where are you taking us, and why? I can't see any harm in your telling us.
You are being brought to Kroll, said the girl. And don't mock me, Hublander, else I'll use the wand. I must bring you in alive, but no one said anything about bringing you in whole. My name is Marchesa, and I am a wizard of the 5th level. Do you understand?
Well, since you know all about me, then you know that I never even made it to neophyte,
Said Rincewind.
I'm not even a wizard, really.
He caught Two Flowers' astonished expression and added hastily,
Just a wizard of sorts.
You can't do magic because one of the 8 great spells is indelibly lodged in your mind, said Marchesa, shifting her balance gracefully as the great lens described a wide arc over the sea. That's why you were thrown out of Unseen University. We know.
But you said just now that he was a magician of great cunning and artifice,
protested Two Flower.
Yes, because anyone who survives all that he has survived, most of which was brought on himself by his tendency to think of himself as a wizard, well, he must be some kind of a magician, said Marchesa. I warn you, Rincewind, if you give me the merest suspicion that you are intoning the great spell, I really will kill you.
She scowled at him nervously.
Seems to me your best course would be to just, drop us off somewhere,
said Rincewind.
I mean, thanks for rescuing us and everything. So if you just let us go on with leading our lives, I'm sure we'd all. I hope you're not proposing to enslave us, said Two Flower.
Marchesa looked genuinely shocked.
Certainly not. Whatever could have given you that idea? Your lives in Kroll will be rich, full, and comfortable. Oh, good,
said Rincewind.
Just not for very long.
Kroll turned out to be a large island, quite mountainous and heavily wooded, with pleasant white buildings visible here and there among the trees. The land sloped gradually up toward the rim, so that the highest point in Kroll, in fact, slightly overhung the edge. Here the Krollians had built their major city, also called Kroll, and since so much of their building material had been salvaged from the circumference, the houses of Kroll had a decidedly nautical persuasion. To put it bluntly, entire ships had been mortised artfully together and converted into buildings. Triremes, dhows, and caravels protruded at strange angles from the general wooden chaos. Painted figureheads and hublandish dragon prows reminded the citizens of Kroll that their good fortune stemmed from the sea. Barquintines and carracks lent a distinctive shape to the larger buildings, and so the city rose tier on tier between the blue-green ocean of the disk and the soft cloud sea of the edge, the 8 colors of the rainbow reflected in every window and in the many telescope lenses of the city's multitude of astronomers.
It's absolutely awful,
said Rincewind gloomily. The lens was approaching now along the very lip of the rimfall. The island not only got higher as it neared the edge, it got narrower too, so that the lens was able to remain over water until it was very near the city. The parapet along the edgewise cliff was dotted with gantries projecting into nothingness. The lens glided smoothly toward one of them and docked with it as smoothly as a boat might glide up to a quay. 4 guards, with the same moonlight hair and night black faces as Machiza, were waiting. They did not appear to be armed, but as Two Flower and Rincewind stumbled onto the parapet, they were each grabbed by the arms and held quite firmly enough for any thought of escape to be instantly dismissed. Then Marchesa and the waiting hydrophobic wizards were quickly left behind, and the guards and their prisoners set off briskly along a lane that wound between the ship houses. Soon it led downward into what turned out to be a palace of some sort, half hewn out of the rock of the cliff itself. Rincewind was vaguely aware of brightly lit tunnels and courtyards open to the distant sky. A few elderly men, their robes covered in mysterious occult symbols, stood aside and watched with interest as the sextet passed. Several times Rincewind noticed hydrophobes. Their ingrained expressions of self-revulsion at their own body fluids was distinctive. And here and there, trudging men who could only be slaves. He didn't have much time to reflect on all this before a door was opened ahead of them, and they were pushed gently but firmly into a room. Then the door slammed behind them. Rincewind and Two Flower regained their balance and stared around the room in which they now found themselves. "Gosh," said Two Flower ineffectually, after a pause during which he had tried unsuccessfully to find a better word. "This is a prison cell?" wondered Rincewind aloud. "All that gold and silken stuff," Two Flower added. "I've never seen anything like it." In the center of the richly decorated room, on a carpet that was so deep and furry that Rincewind trod on it gingerly, lest it be some kind of shaggy floor-loving beast, was a long, gleaming table laden with food. Most were fish dishes, including the biggest and most ornately prepared lobster Rincewind had ever seen. But there were also plenty of bowls and platters piled with strange creations that he had never seen before. He reached out cautiously and picked up some sort of purple fruit crusted with green crystals. "Candied sea urchin," said a cracked, cheerful voice behind him. "A great delicacy." He dropped it quickly and turned around. An old man had stepped out from behind the heavy curtains. He was tall, thin, and looked almost benign compared to some of the faces Rincewind had seen recently. "The puree of sea cucumbers is very good too," said the face conversationally. "Those little green bits are baby starfish." "Thank you for telling me," said Rincewind weakly. "Actually, they're rather good," said Two Flower, his mouth full. "I thought you liked seafood." "Yes, I thought I did," said Rincewind. "What's this wine? Crushed octopus eyeballs?" "Sea grape," said the old man. "Great," said Rincewind, and swallowed a glassful. "Not bad. A bit salty, maybe." "Sea grape is a kind of small jellyfish," explained the stranger. "And now I really think I should introduce myself. Why has your friend gone that strange color?" "Culture shock, I imagine," said Two Flower. "What did you say your name was?" "I didn't. It's Garhartra. I'm the guest master, you see. It is my pleasant task to make sure that your stay here is as delightful as possible." He bowed. "If there is anything you want, you have only to say." Two Flower sat down on an ornate mother-of-pearl chair with a glass of oily wine in one hand and a crystallized squid in the other. He frowned. "I think I've missed something along the way," he said.
First, we were told we were going to be slaves. A base canard, interrupted Garhartra. What's a canard? Said Two-Flower. I think it's a kind of duck, said Rincewind from the far end of the long table. Are these biscuits made of something really nauseating, do you suppose? And then we were rescued at great magical expense. They're made of pressed seaweed, snapped the guest master. But then we're threatened also at vast expenditure of magic. Yes, I thought it would be something like seaweed, agreed Rincewind. They certainly taste like seaweed would taste if anyone was so masochistic enough to eat seaweed. And then we're manhandled by guards and thrown in here. Pushed gently, corrected Gerhartra, which turned out to be this amazingly rich room. And there's all this food and a man saying he's devoting his life to making us happy. Two-Flower concluded. What I'm getting at is this sort of lack of consistency. Yar, said Rincewind. What he means is, are you about to start being generally unpleasant again? Is this just a break for lunch? Garhartra held up his hands reassuringly. Please, please, he protested. It was just necessary to get you here as soon as possible. We certainly do not want to enslave you. Please be reassured on that score. Well, fine, said Rincewind. Yes, you will in fact be sacrificed, Garhartra continued placidly. Sacrificed? You're going to kill us, shouted the wizard. Kill? Yes, of course, certainly. It would hardly be a sacrifice if we didn't, would it? But don't worry, it will be comparatively painless. Comparatively? Compared to what? Said Rincewind. He picked up a tall green bottle that was full of sea grape jellyfish wine and hurled it hard at the guest master, who flung up a hand as if to protect himself. There was a crackle of octarine flame from his fingers, and the air suddenly took on the thick, greasy feel that indicated a powerful magic discharge. The flung bottle slowed and then stopped in midair, rotating gently. At the same time, an invisible force picked Rincewind up and hurled him down the length of the room, pinning him awkwardly halfway up the far wall with no breath left in his body. He hung there with his mouth open in rage and astonishment. Garhartra lowered his hand and brushed it slowly on his robe. I didn't enjoy doing that, you know, he said. I could tell, muttered Rincewind. But what do you want to sacrifice us for? Asked Two-Flower. You hardly know us. That's rather the point, isn't it? It's not very good manners to sacrifice a friend. Besides, you were, specified. I don't know a lot about the god in question, but he was quite clear on that point. Look, I must be running along now. So much to organize. You know how it is. The guest master opened the door and then peered back around it. Please make yourselves comfortable and don't worry. But you haven't actually told us anything, wailed Two-Flower. It's not really worth it, is it? What with you being sacrificed in the morning, said Garhartra. It's hardly worth the bother of knowing, really. Sleep well, comparatively well, anyway. He shut the door. A brief octarine flicker of balefire around it suggested that it had now been sealed beyond the skills of any earthly locksmith. Gling, clang, tang, went the bells along the circumference in the moonlight.
rimfall roaring in the moonlit rimfall roaring nights. Turton, lengthman of the 45th length, hadn't heard such a clashing since the night a giant kraken had been swept into the fence 5 years ago. He leaned out of his hut, which, for the lack of any convenient eyot on this length, had been built on wooden piles driven into the seabed, and stared into the darkness. Once or twice he thought he could see movement far off. Strictly speaking, he should row out to see what was causing the din. But here in the clammy darkness, it didn't seem like an astoundingly good idea. So he slammed the door, wrapped some sacking around the madly jangling bells, and tried to get back to sleep. That didn't work, because even the top strand of the fence was thrumming now, as if something big and heavy was bouncing on it. After staring at the ceiling for a few minutes and trying hard not to think of great long tentacles and pond-sized eyes, Turton blew out the lantern and opened the door a crack. Something was coming along the fence, in giant loping bounds that covered meters at a time. It loomed up at him, and for a moment Turton saw something rectangular, multi-legged, shaggy with seaweed, and although it had absolutely no features from which he could have deduced this, it was also very angry indeed. The hut was smashed to fragments as the monster charged through it, although Turton survived by clinging to the circumference. Some weeks later, he was picked up by a returning salvage fleet, subsequently escaped from Kroll on a hijacked lens, having developed hydrophobia to an astonishing degree, and after a number of adventures, eventually found his way to the Great Neff, an area of the disk so dry that it actually has negative rainfall, which he nevertheless considered uncomfortably damp.
Have you tried the door?
Yes, said Two Flower.
And it isn't any less locked than it was last time you asked. There's the window, though. A great way to escape, muttered Rincewind from his perch halfway up the wall. You said it looks out over the edge. Just step out, and plunge through space, and maybe freeze solid or hit some other world at incredible speeds or plunge wildly into the burning heart of a sun. Worth a try, said Two Flower. Want a seaweed biscuit? No. When are you coming down?
Rincewind snarled. This was partly in embarrassment. Garhartra's spell had been the little used and hard to master Atavar's personal gravitational upset, the practical result of which was that until it wore off, Rincewind's body was convinced that down lay at 90 degrees to that direction normally accepted as of a downward persuasion by the majority of the disk's inhabitants. He was, in fact, standing on the wall. Meanwhile, the flung bottle hung supportless in the air a few yards away. In its case, time had, well, not actually been stopped, but had been slowed by several orders of magnitude, and its trajectory had so far occupied several hours and a couple of inches as far as Two Flower and Rincewind were concerned. The glass gleamed in the moonlight. Rincewind sighed and tried to make himself comfortable on the wall.
Why don't you ever worry? He demanded petulantly. Here we are, going to be sacrificed to some god or other in the morning, and you just sit there eating barnacle canapes. I expect something will turn up, said Two Flower. I mean, it's not as if we know why we're going to be killed, the wizard went on. You'd like to, would you? Did you say that? Asked Rincewind. Say what? You're hearing things, said the voice in Rincewind's head. He sat bolt sideways. Who are you?
he demanded. Two-Flower gave him a worried look.
I'm Two-Flower, he said. Surely you remember?
Rincewind put his head in his hands.
It's happened at last, he moaned. I'm going out of my mind. Good idea, said the voice. It's getting pretty crowded in here.
The spell pinning Rincewind to the wall vanished with a faint. He fell forward and landed in a heap on the floor.
Careful, you nearly squashed me.
Rincewind struggled to his elbows and reached into the pocket of his robe. When he withdrew his hand, the green frog was sitting on it, its eyes oddly luminous in the half-light.
You,
said Rincewind,
put me down on the floor and stand back.
The frog blinked. The wizard did so and dragged a bewildered Two-Flower out of the way. The room darkened. There was a windy, roaring sound. Streamers of green, purple, and octarine cloud appeared out of nowhere and began to spiral rapidly toward the recumbent amphibian, shedding small bolts of lightning as they whirled. Soon the frog was lost in a golden haze, which began to elongate upward, filling the room with a warm yellow light. Within it was a darker, indistinct shape, which wavered and changed even as they watched. And all the time there was the high, brain-curling whine of a huge, magical field. As suddenly as it had appeared, the magical tornado vanished, and there, occupying the space where the frog had been, was a frog.
Fantastic,
said Rincewind. The frog gazed at him reproachfully.
Really amazing, said Rincewind sourly. A frog magically transformed into a frog. Wondrous.
Turn around, said a voice behind them. It was a soft, feminine voice, almost an inviting voice, the sort of voice you could have a few drinks with, but it was coming from a spot where there oughtn't to be a voice at all. They managed to turn without really moving, like a couple of statues revolving on plinths. There was a woman standing in the pre-dawn light. She had in point of actual fact, Later, Rincewind and Two-Flower couldn't quite agree on any single fact about her, except that she had appeared to be beautiful. Precisely what physical features made her beautiful they could not definitively state, and that she had green eyes. Not the pale green of ordinary eyes either. These were the green of fresh emeralds and as iridescent as a dragonfly. And one of the few genuinely magical facts that Rincewind knew was that no god or goddess, contrary and volatile as they might be in all other respects, could change the color or nature of their eyes. He began. She raised a hand. You know that if you say my name, I must depart, she hissed. Surely you recall that I am the one goddess who comes only when not invoked.
Oh, yes, I suppose I do,
croaked the wizard, trying not to look at the eyes.
You're the only one they call the lady?
Yes.
Are you a goddess then? Said Two-Flower excitedly. I've always wanted to meet one.
Rincewind tensed, waiting for the explosion of rage. Instead, the lady merely smiled. Your friend the wizard should introduce us, she said. Rincewind coughed.
Yar, he said. This is Two-Flower, lady. He's a tourist. I have attended him on a number of occasions. And Two-Flower, this is the lady, just the lady, right? Nothing else. Don't try and give her any other name, okay?
He went on desperately, his eyes darting meaningful glances that were totally lost on the little man. Rincewind shivered. He was not, of course, an atheist. On the disc, the gods dealt severely with atheists. On the few occasions when he had some spare change, he had always made a point of dropping a few coppers into a temple coffer, somewhere on the principle that a man needed all the friends he could get. But usually he didn't bother the gods, and he hoped the gods wouldn't bother him. Life was quite complicated enough. There were two gods, however, who were really terrifying. The rest of the gods were usually only sort of large-scale humans, fond of wine and war and whoring, but Fate and the Lady were chilling. In the gods' quarter in Ankh-Morpork, Fate had a small, heavy, leaden temple where hollow-eyed and gaunt worshippers met on dark nights for their predestined and fairly pointless rites. There were no temples at all to the Lady, although she was arguably the most powerful goddess in the entire history of creation. A few of the more daring members of the Gamblers Guild had once experimented with a form of worship in the deepest cellars of guild headquarters and had all died of penury, murder, or just death within the week. She was the goddess who must not be named. Those who sought her never found her, yet she was known to come to the aid of those in greatest need. And then again, sometimes she didn't. She was like that. She didn't like the clicking of rosaries, but was attracted to the sound of dice. No man knew what she looked like, although there were many times when a man who was gambling his life on the turn of the cards would pick up the hand he had been dealt and stare her full in the face. Of course, sometimes he didn't. Among all the gods, she was at one and the same time the most courted and the most cursed.